The sound of iron-shod boots hitting the ground once meant everything was changing in terms of how people organized for power. It wasn't just a group of soldiers. The Roman military worked more like a machine that was held together by a lot of structural ingenuity. There were 25 specific breakthroughs that let this one city-state outlast every other rival they came across. It was a blueprint for an empire where engineering and psychology were used together to break down obstacles. They had a specialized javelin designed to disable an enemy shield before a fight even started, and a naval bridge that could turn a battle at sea into a land engagement. This whole system began with a shift in how soldiers actually moved across a battlefield. It brings up the question of whether a perfectly organized society represents a sense of security or a loss of freedom. The Roman army started out learning from the land, specifically the slopes and the rocky cliffs of the mountains. Before they controlled the Mediterranean, they were using the phalanx, which was just this rigid block of spears. It worked on flat ground, but it completely fell apart in the highlands of Italy. During the Samnite Wars, the Romans saw that a single ravine or a rock could break their line, and then that massive wall of shields just became a liability. They had to break their own tradition and start over. That was the beginning of the Maniple System. The name comes from the Latin word for a handful. They took that one big wave and broke it down into small units of maybe 100 or 120 men. These maniples were like scales on armor. They moved together to protect each other, but they could also shift on their own to get around an obstacle or take a hit. They set them up in a checkerboard pattern with gaps between them. It meant the second line could step up to fill a hole, or the front line could pull back through the spaces without everyone panicking. It changed how the fighting actually worked. For the first time, the battle didn't just depend on a general watching from a hill somewhere. It was in the hands of the officers in the middle, the ones who could see a local opening and just take it without waiting for an order. If they saw a gap in the enemy line, one maniple could just rush in. It made the army modular. You couldn't kill it with one strike to the heart anymore. It was like a machine with parts you could replace. So if one section failed, the rest of the structure stayed solid. And that agility in the mountains changed how they looked at their own men. They stopped categorizing them just by how much money they had and started looking at their experience and the specific roles they played in that system. Power wasn't tied to owning land anymore or being a farmer. The whole basis of who could fight and how the city handled its wars just shifted. Before that point, being a soldier was more of a temporary thing you did. You'd go out in the summer and then you'd head back home in time for the harvest. An army was basically just farmers who would grab a sword whenever they were needed. But the borders kept moving further out, and a seasonal militia couldn't really hold those lines anymore. Gaius Marius saw that the empire needed something more consistent than just courage. He opened up the military to the landless poor, the people who didn't have farms to go back to or property of their own. For those men, the legion wasn't a chore they did for a few months, it was a career. It was a way to get a better life with a steady wage and a promise that they'd get land when they finished their service. That's how the first real standing army of the ancient world started. When a soldier spends his whole life training, he gets to a level of skill a part-time fighter just can't reach. They practiced their formations until the whole group moved like one organism, even in a storm or when it was pitch black. This professional way of doing things changed where they put their trust too. The state and the generals were the ones providing their gear and their livelihood, so the troops started focusing their loyalty on their leaders and their specific unit instead of their homes. They became their own class of people. They had their own traditions and their own slang, and this shared identity that didn't care about what social background they came from. They weren't just citizens who fought sometimes, they were warriors by trade. This new kind of soldier needed more than just a sense of duty to survive years away in far-off places. They needed standardized gear that worked in any climate and could solve any problem. It made every man a self-sufficient force, capable of building a world from the ground up. Every soldier was essentially a mobile fortress, but you have to have the right tools to actually defend those walls. The most important tool they had was something they didn't even come up with on their own. When they were campaigning in the Iberian Peninsula, the Romans found this blade that worked so well they just gave up on their own designs. This was the Gladius Hispaniensis. It was a short sword with two edges, and it eventually became known as the blade that conquered the world. If you just looked at it, it might not have seemed as impressive as those long swords the northern tribes used, but it was just incredibly efficient. A long sword needs a lot of room for a big, circular swing, and a Roman soldier didn't have that kind of space. They were fighting shoulder to shoulder in these dense crowds. If you tried to swing a weapon there, you'd probably hit the person next to you or get it caught on a tree branch. The Gladius was for a different kind of fight. The weight was perfect for a quick, direct thrust. A soldier could stay tucked behind a massive shield and just expose a few inches of steel for a second, and that was enough to neutralize a threat without leaving himself open. It was a cold way to do it, methodical. There wasn't any room for flair or the kind of glory you get in a duel. The design just forced everyone to think about the group. If you were a Roman soldier, you weren't trying to look like a hero. You were just a single gear in a machine that kept moving forward. They chose utility over ego, so even when things were chaotic, a legionary stayed protected and stayed composed. And that focus on precision at close range only worked because of the massive, curved barrier every man carried into the fight. The scutum was this tall, curved barrier that basically turned a soldier into a piece of moving architecture. It wasn't just a basic plank of wood. It was actually a pretty sophisticated bit of engineering where they took 3 layers of thin wooden strips and glued them together in a crosswise pattern. That made the whole thing incredibly strong, but it stayed flexible enough to take a heavy hit without just shattering. Then they'd wrap the edges in iron or bronze and cover the front in leather, so the Romans ended up with a defensive tool that was almost impossible to break through. When a legionary was standing behind it, he was covered from his chin all the way down to his shins. There just weren't many gaps for an opponent to find. Even with its size, the design worked because of that curved shape. Instead of taking a direct hit flat on, the shield would deflect stones and arrows away from the center, so they just slid off to the side without doing any damage. Right in the middle, there was a heavy metal boss, which was this rounded dome of iron. It had a very specific purpose. If an enemy got too close, the soldier wouldn't just stand there. He'd use the shield to punch outward, using that metal boss to stagger the other person or knock them off balance. It was a shield, but it was also a blunt instrument that let the soldier create enough space to use his sword. That level of protection is what led to some of those famous shapes in military history. Since every shield was a standardized rectangle, they could fit them together like tiles on a roof. They called it the testudo or the tortoise. A group of men would pack in tight, with the front row holding their shields forward and the men behind them lifting theirs overhead. It created this solid shell of wood and metal that moved across the ground like one armored creature. There are ancient accounts of these formations being under a literal rain of projectiles, with hundreds of arrows just bouncing off the surface while no one inside got hurt. It let the Romans walk right up to city walls or into the middle of a battle while staying safe from the chaos above them. Being able to move through danger without stopping gave them a psychological edge. They could just keep advancing at a walking pace while the enemy got tired and frustrated trying to find a way in. Putting together a shell made of wood and iron took a lot more than just having the right equipment. The Testudo Formation really changed things because it turned a group of separate people into one single machine. It was this masterclass in collective discipline, and when they did it, the needs of the unit just completely took over any individual desire for glory. Once the command went out, the Legionaries would pull in so tight that you couldn't see any daylight between their bodies. The men in the front and on the sides held their shields up vertically to make a wall, and then the guys in the middle would lift theirs horizontally over their heads. They overlapped the edges like shingles on a roof. It created this mobile, armored box that could just deflect stones and arrows or even heavy things being thrown down from a fortification. It was slow, and the soldiers couldn't see much, but it turned them into this force that could just march into the mouth of a storm without breaking the rank. Seeing this metallic beast coming at you must have been terrifying from the other side. An enemy wasn't looking at a crowd of people who might scatter or run away. They were looking at a seamless, rhythmic entity that seemed like it couldn't be hurt. That psychological pressure worked like a weapon because it showed that no amount of projectiles was going to stop the Romans from advancing. Keeping that level of coordination together in all the noise and the dust was only something you could do through a grueling standard of physical training. Every man had to know exactly where his shield was supposed to be at every second. He was trusting his life to the person standing right next to him. That trust was the glue holding the whole structure together. It took a level of fitness and mental endurance that was unheard of for that time, and it turned the act of walking into an act of engineering. Since they focused so much on this heavy, standardized protection, the legions could survive anywhere, but it also meant they had to find a way to carry that entire world on their backs across thousands of miles. To deal with the oldest problem in warfare, they turned every soldier into a walking logistics hub. Before this, an army could only move as fast as its slowest ox, and you'd have thousands of wagons full of food and tools stretching out for miles. It was this huge, vulnerable tail that an enemy could just strike, and if those wagons were taken, the whole army would starve in a few days, so the generals decided the soldiers would just carry the entire camp themselves. Each legionary was given a heavy wooden pole shaped like a T, and they'd hang everything they needed to survive for weeks from that crossbar. They had their cooking pots and saws and spades, several days of grain, even the leather hides for the tents. When you put that together with their armor and weapons, a soldier was often hauling more than 60 pounds. It was a brutal requirement, and it changed how the Roman infantry looked. The men started calling themselves Marius mules. It was a joke about the grinding labor of the march, but it also showed a kind of pride in what they could endure. Turning the army into these self-sufficient individuals gave the legions a level of independence no one else had. They could leave the roads and go through forests or deserts without waiting for a baggage train. They'd arrive at a destination days or weeks before an enemy thought they could, which gave the Roman command a huge strategic advantage. They could decide exactly when and where a battle would happen. A group of these mules could march 20 miles in a day, drop those packs, and still build a fortified camp before sunset. That speed was only possible because they weren't just carrying everything they needed. They were actively shaping the terrain as they went. Every step was backed by this obsession with building a permanent, reliable path through the wilderness. Building an empire took more than just moving through the forests or over the hills. The Romans had to actually tie the land together using stone and their own labor to really own it. They understood that the size of an empire is limited by how fast a messenger can travel, and a legion can only do its job if the ground holds up under them. So they built this paved network that was so far ahead of its time it made the ancient world feel smaller. Most other cultures would just follow these winding dirt paths that turned into swamps as soon as it rained, but the Romans engineered straight, permanent arteries. They tried to ignore the natural curves of the earth whenever they could. These roads weren't just gravel thrown on the dirt either. They were deep structures with multiple layers. It started with a trench filled with heavy boulders to make a foundation, and then the engineers would add layers of crushed stone and gravel mixed with lime. It was a kind of early concrete that could support incredible weight. For the top surface, they used these huge paving stones that fit together tightly, and they curved them slightly in the middle so the rainwater would just run off into ditches on the sides. Because of that engineering, you could have 1,000 soldiers marching through a downpour without ever getting stuck in any mud. It gave the people in the city a huge advantage, both tactically and psychologically. If there was a rebellion somewhere far away on the frontier, the legions moved at a pace that was constant and predictable. They could crush it before the news even reached the next region over. It meant supplies and heavy equipment and reinforcements could all move fast. The road itself was a way to intimidate people because it showed that the state could reach anywhere. An enemy might hide in the mountains, but they knew a straight line of stone would eventually find them. They weren't just visiting these places, they were anchoring themselves there forever. But even with that mastery of the landscape, they eventually hit a limit that stone couldn't solve. Their ambitions reached the edge of the sea, and they had to take that same engineering mindset and figure out how to apply it to the waves. The Romans didn't really understand how to fight on the open water at first, and it was basically a barrier they couldn't get past. They were going up against Carthage, and these were the best sailors in the Mediterranean who had been ramming and sinking ships for centuries. The Romans were more like land animals, and they were stuck in this game where they didn't know any of the rules. Their first fleets were just clumsy. The sailors didn't have experience, and the Carthaginian navy had these fast, agile hulls that were just picking them apart. So the Romans decided they weren't going to try to outsail them. They were going to change what the sea was. They stopped looking at their ships as things for navigation and started seeing them as floating platforms for their infantry. They came up with this device called the Corvus, which means raven in Latin. It was a boarding bridge maybe 36 feet long, and it sat on a swivel at the front of the ship. There was this heavy, pointed iron spike at the end of it that looked like a beak. When a Carthaginian ship would try to zip past them or come in to ram, the Romans would just drop the Corvus. It would come down with this huge crash, and that iron beak would bite right into the wooden deck of the other ship. It locked them together. Suddenly, the battle wasn't about steering or speed anymore. It was about strength. The bridge gave the legionaries a way to just storm across, and it turned a sea engagement into a land battle. The Carthaginians were specialists at sea, but they weren't necessarily elite at hand-to-hand fighting, and now they were facing the most disciplined infantry in the world right there on their own decks. It was just pragmatism. The Romans took their weakness and built a bridge over it so the enemy had to play a game they were going to lose. It won them the war, but it cost them a lot. The Corvus made the ships top-heavy. They were unstable, and when the weather got rough, a lot of Roman vessels just capsized because of the weight and the way the bridge caught the wind. They eventually stopped using it as they got better at being sailors, but the lesson was there. If the environment didn't work for how they fought, they would engineer a way to bring their own environment with them. They had this need to dominate the space around them, and it followed the legions everywhere, even when they ran into the massive walls of fortified cities. They took that same mechanical logic they used at sea and applied it to stones and gates. A stone wall used to be where an army just had to stop, but the Romans looked at fortifications as more of an engineering challenge than a dead end. They had this machine called the Onager. It was named after a type of wild donkey because of how hard it could kick. It was a huge catapult, but it didn't use a counterweight. It worked on torsion, where they would take these thick bundles of animal hair and sinew and just twist them until the tension was massive. Once they released all that energy, a heavy arm would swing up and slam into a padded beam, and that would send a boulder flying through the air. These stones weren't just hitting the masonry, they were transferring so much kinetic energy that the stone walls would eventually just turn into rubble. And the machines were accurate. A commander could choose one specific part of a gate or a tower and just keep hitting it until the whole thing collapsed. There was a real psychological side to it too. If you were inside the city, you'd just be sitting there listening to the thud of the machine and then that whistling sound as the stone came down. Then the ground would shake. It made people feel completely helpless because the walls they thought were safe were being taken apart from a distance. Sometimes just seeing the Romans start to put these machines together outside the city was enough. A leader would see them and realize the walls weren't going to last, so they'd surrender before the first stone was even launched. The Onager was for the heavy work, but they usually used it alongside smaller machines that were much faster. The Romans weren't only interested in breaking down walls, they wanted to control how people moved in the open. They made these smaller, portable weapons that worked almost like a mechanical sniper. It was a version of their artillery that was built for speed and a direct line of sight. It made it so an enemy couldn't even stand still without being a target. It shows that the Roman military wasn't just using brute force. They were applying pressure with enough precision that there was nowhere left for anyone to hide. Breaking a resistance wasn't just about power, it was about precision. The heavy catapults would go to work on the masonry, but the ballista was there for the people defending it. It was basically a giant crossbow on a tripod, a mechanical sniper rifle for that world. It had these two vertical bundles made of twisted cord or animal sinew that stored up a huge amount of energy. When you pulled the trigger, all that energy let go and sent an iron-tipped bolt or a stone right through armor and wood from a distance. The Roman engineers had a real obsession with the math behind it. They used specific formulas to figure out the size and the tension for whatever range they were looking for. These weren't just built on the fly, either. They used standardized kits with metal parts forged in central factories, and then they'd ship them out to the frontiers. A group of soldiers could put one together right there on the battlefield and know the pieces were going to fit. There are accounts of these bolts having enough power to go through several people at once. It created this gap in technology that was terrifying. An enemy commander would think he was safe behind a parapet or a wooden screen, but the Romans could reach out and hit him from hundreds of yards away. It forced people to stay down and hide. That gave the legionaries the room they needed to move their ladders and siege towers up to the walls. The air itself became a danger zone. It wasn't just the casualties, it was the pressure of knowing that nowhere was actually out of reach. But the Romans didn't let their guard down, even after a day of using that kind of machinery. They understood that the most dangerous time for an army is when the sun goes down and everyone is tired. To deal with that, they had a system where they built a city out of wood and earth every night they were moving. When the march was over, they didn't just stop and sleep. They took their shovels and started the process of carving a temporary fortress into the ground. Safety for a Roman soldier was something he had to build for himself at the end of every single day. It didn't matter if the legion had been marching for 10 hours through the mud or the rain. The work just didn't stop when the sun started to set. They followed this rigid protocol they called the castra, which was the construction of a rectangular fortified camp. Before anyone was allowed to eat or rest, the entire unit would get to work digging a deep trench around a massive perimeter. They would take the earth from that trench and pile it into a high bank, and then they'd top it with a wooden palisade made from the stakes every man carried on his back. By the time it was dark, the army wasn't just sitting out in an open field anymore. They were behind a wall, shielded from the shadows and the unknown threats of the wilderness. This wasn't just about physical protection, it was about the psychology of order. No matter where the army was in the world, whether they were in the deserts of the east or the forests of the north, the camp was always laid out in the exact same way. The tents for the generals were in the same spot, the infirmary was always in its place, and the streets were perfectly straight and organized. It meant a soldier from one legion could walk into a camp built by a completely different unit and know exactly where to find water or food or his own commanding officer, even in total darkness. In the middle of a chaotic and hostile territory, the camp felt like a little piece of Rome that they carried with them. It prevented the panic that usually comes with a surprise night attack because everyone knew exactly where their station was and what their role would be. Building these structures every night sent a powerful message to any enemy watching from the hills. It showed that the Romans were methodical and disciplined, and that they were never truly vulnerable. They refused to leave anything to chance or luck. This obsession with controlling the environment and staying prepared meant the soldiers were always in a position of strength before a single drop of sweat was spent in combat. That mindset of constant preparation and structural control followed them right onto the front lines of the battlefield itself. Long before the two armies actually met in a clash of shields, the Romans were already using their technical skill to thin the enemy ranks and create an opening for their victory. The Romans looked at precision in a different way, and you see that in how they built a spear specifically designed to break. It was called the Pilum. Most armies back then were using these heavy wooden spears, but the problem was an enemy could just catch them on a shield or even pick them up and throw them back at you. Roman engineers realized that was a flaw, so they used physics to fix it. They made this weapon with a very long, thin iron neck that was attached to a wooden shaft. When the iron point hit something, the weight of that wooden handle would force the thin metal neck to bend. That bending was the whole point of it. If a pilum hit a wooden shield, it would bury itself deep, and then the bent metal would make it impossible to pull out while you were in the middle of a fight. Suddenly, the enemy is standing there holding a shield with a 7-foot pole dangling off the front of it, just dragging on the ground. It turned the shield into dead weight. A lot of the time, the opponent just had to drop their shield and go into the fight completely exposed, which is what the Romans were after. By the time the legions got close enough to use their swords, the enemy was already disorganized. They were defenseless. It was a way to win the psychological part of the battle by taking away a person's sense of security right before the impact. That same kind of attention to detail was used in how the army was governed. They knew a massive force couldn't be managed just by a few generals, so they built a middle layer of leadership that became the backbone of the system. These were the centurions. They were the officers who lived through the same hardships as the common soldiers. A general might come from a wealthy family, but a centurion usually earned his spot through years of service and merit. They were the ones who took complex orders from the top and turned them into actual movement on the ground. The centurion was the face of discipline. They often carried a vine staff as a symbol of their authority to keep the men in line. Having these veteran leaders throughout the ranks meant the legion could react on its own. If a section of the line started to buckle or if a threat came from the side, the centurion didn't have to wait for a messenger to go back to headquarters. He had the experience to make a decision right there. This layer of command gave the army a level of oversight that kept the men calm and the formations tight, even when things got desperate. It was a hierarchy based on respect and competence instead of just social status. It kept the machinery of the legion moving forward. This focus on small unit leadership worked because every man was part of a specialized group that lived and worked like a single family. The strength of a legion unit really came down to the one man standing at the corner of the line who held the whole thing together. That was the centurion. He had a type of authority that was new to the ancient world. Most of the high-ranking generals were just men from wealthy families, but the centurions were different. They had spent 20 or 30 years in the dust and the mud. They were veterans who got there because they were competent and could endure the life, not because of a name or some political connection. So when a common soldier looked at his officer, he saw someone who had already survived everything he was going through right then. It built a specific kind of trust. It kept the line from breaking. The Centurion lived in the same tents as the men, and he ate the same rations. He marched the same miles they did. Because he was always there, the discipline he enforced was very personal, even though it was strict. They carried these vine wood staffs, and they'd use them to physically correct any soldier who wasn't in the right spot or wasn't meeting the standard. Then in a battle, when it got so loud you couldn't even hear the trumpets or the drums, the Centurion became the tactical anchor. He didn't have to wait for a meeting or a map to tell him what to do. He just understood the rhythm of the fight. He could see a weak point or a gap and make a decision in a split second to fix it. That middle management gave the Roman military a professional stability that was almost impossible to rattle. Even if a general messed up, the centurions could usually hold the pieces together because they had the experience and the men respected them. It was a very solid internal structure. But the Romans also knew that even a perfect machine needs specialized tools for different terrain. They were great at heavy infantry, but they weren't necessarily the best at riding horses or using bows. Instead of forcing their own citizens to learn every single skill, they built the auxiliary system. They would look at the places they conquered and figure out what those people were best at. If a province was known for its cavalry or its skirmishers, the Romans just recruited them to fight right next to the legions. It turned the army into a tapestry of different cultures and specialties, but it was all under that same Roman command. It filled the gaps. It meant that whether they were in a thick forest or on a flat plain, they had the right specialized skill for that specific job. You had this rigid internal discipline mixed with this very flexible external support, and that's what made them a universal force. It is hard for one kind of soldier to win a war when they are fighting across a whole continent and dealing with every different type of terrain. The Romans understood that. They knew their heavy infantry was a hammer, but there were times when they needed a scalpel or something faster, so they built the auxiliary system. It was a way to outsource specialized talent from all these different places they were moving into. They would look at the people they had just defeated, and they wouldn't just take the land. They would look at what those people did better than anyone else. If a specific culture was known for its archers or its horsemen, the Romans didn't bother trying to teach a legionary from the city how to ride or how to use a bow. They just hired the people who were already experts. You ended up with this very diverse force. You might have archers from Crete providing cover, while Numidian light cavalry from North Africa moved in to harass the flanks. The Balearic slingers are one of the famous examples of this. These were men who had been using slings since they were children, and they could hit a target from hundreds of yards away with a lot of speed and a lot of force. By bringing all these groups in, the military became a collection of specialists. They could handle almost any situation. It meant the legions were rarely outmatched because they always had a countermove ready for whatever the enemy was doing. There was more to it than just the tactics, though. The system was a massive engine for social integration. An auxiliary soldier wasn't a mercenary just working for a paycheck. He was promised full Roman citizenship for himself and his whole family after 25 years of service. That was the prize. It turned former enemies into very loyal defenders of the borders. You had men from Gaul and Syria and Britain all working toward the same goal, wearing the gear and following the commands. It wove the empire together. It made the defense of the place a shared responsibility. Managing a force like that was complicated because they spoke dozens of different languages and used different fighting styles. It required sophisticated communication. They couldn't just rely on shouting, especially if the wind was high or there was thick dust everywhere. They had to develop a visual and auditory language using symbols and sounds that could cut through that noise. It ensured that a soldier knew exactly when to advance or when to hold his ground. no matter where he was originally from. That reliance on signals became the heartbeat of the army. It took a crowd of different cultures and turned them into a single pulse that followed the commands of the empire. In the middle of a battle, you have the wind and the sound of thousands of boots hitting the ground, and it just swallows up a human voice. It's total sensory overload. The Romans had to deal with that chaos, so they built this system of visual and auditory pulses to keep things moving. They knew a soldier couldn't see his general or hear someone shouting from 40 yards away when things got heavy. So they used a signifer. He was an officer who carried this tall timber pole with a metal hand or these discs on top. It wasn't just decorative, it was a beacon. If that standard moved forward, the men moved. If it turned, the whole line pivoted with it. They were trained to stay locked on that symbol because as long as it was upright, the unit was still a single entity. It stayed alive, and losing it was a huge disgrace, so they fought with this desperate energy just to protect the man carrying it. It was a psychological anchor. It kept everyone from turning into a disorganized mob. Then you have the sound, because the soldiers were also listening for the cornu and the tuba. These were heavy brass horns, one curved and one straight, and they weren't for music. They made these deep, piercing notes that could cut through the sound of steel clashing and men shouting. Each sequence meant something specific. One blast told a division to halt, and another signaled a charge or a shift in the formation. Since the horns were so loud, those commands traveled across the field in seconds. A commander could basically play the army like an instrument, changing the strategy as the enemy moved. Most ancient battles just fell apart into scattered, individual fights once they started, but the Romans stayed connected through sight and sound. Their structure stayed solid. That stability is what let them use even more complex tools when they had to deal with a city that wouldn't surrender. Once the Romans reached a stone wall, the ground didn't matter as much as the sky did. They had to build these massive wooden structures, these siege towers, just to bridge that gap between the dirt and the top of the ramparts. These weren't just ladders. They were mobile, multi-story buildings on wheels, and they were designed to take the fight right to the top of a fortification. Each one was an engineering feat. They usually stood higher than the walls they were attacking, which meant the soldiers inside could actually look down on the people defending the city. To stop them from being burned by flaming arrows, the Romans would take raw animal hides and soak them in water, then cover the whole front of the tower. It made the wood almost immune to fire. It turned the whole machine into this slow, unstoppable giant. Inside the towers, the space was organized very efficiently. The lower levels usually had a massive ram to hit the base of the wall, while the middle and upper floors were filled with legionaries and light artillery, things like small ballistae. From the very top, they would drop a heavy wooden bridge. It would slam down onto the enemy walkway and create a direct path for the troops to just storm across. For the people inside the city, it was devastating to watch. They'd see this mountain of wood and iron being built in the distance over days or weeks, and then they'd have to listen to the thud of the wheels as it crept closer. It was a visible countdown. The only reason these machines could even exist in a war zone was because of who the Roman soldier was. Most armies were just men who knew how to use weapons, but every legionary was also a trained construction worker. They spent as much time with a spade and an axe as they did with a sword. That was a formal part of their identity. They were taught to look at a forest and see raw materials for bridges and towers, not just a place to hide. Having that combination of physical strength and technical skill meant the army didn't have to wait for craftsmen to come from the rear. They brought the factory and the engineering firm with them. They could reshape the world on command, and it gave them a level of endurance that almost no other culture could match, especially when the landscape itself was the enemy. When a Roman legion reached a river or a forest, the whole group changed into a massive workforce. It was part of who they were, really, acting as a military engineering corps before anyone else had done that. Every soldier carried a spade and a pickaxe right there with his weapons. They had to be just as good with those tools as they were with a sword. They didn't see the natural world as an obstacle or something to be afraid of. To them, it was just raw material they could reshape. If there was a mountain in the way, they just carved a path through it, and if they hit a marsh that was too soft to walk on, they built a stone causeway across it. The most famous time they did this was when Julius Caesar got to the Rhine. The Germanic tribes on the other side thought that water was a natural defense because it was so wide and fast. No army had ever crossed it like that. Caesar didn't look for boats, though. He just told his men to build a bridge. It only took them 10 days. The legionaries went into the forests and got the wood. Then they drove these huge timber pilings into the riverbed. They set them at an angle so they could hold up against the current. They built a wooden highway across water that everyone said was impassable. When it was done, the army just walked across. The speed of it and the sheer scale of the construction was enough to make the tribes retreat without even fighting. The Romans weren't just winning a battle there. They were showing that nature itself couldn't protect you from them. Being able to build bridges or canals or docks whenever they needed to gave a Roman general more options than anyone else. They could make supply lines where there weren't any and move heavy equipment through terrain that would have stopped any other military. That's how the empire expanded so far, because the soldiers had civilization in their tool kits. They were moving earth and wood, but it was all based on this extreme discipline. Every single action was governed by rewards and consequences to keep the machine running. They knew that to control the landscape, they had to have absolute control over the men doing the work. Roman commanders understood that pride was an engine, and they knew how to fuel it with things that went beyond a paycheck. They saw that a soldier needed his bread and his silver to keep going, but he would do things that seemed impossible if it meant getting a public honor everyone could see. So they put together this very specific system of military decorations. It turned every battle into a stage for someone to show their courage. These weren't just trinkets. They were symbols that everyone across the empire recognized and respected. The Corona Civica was one of the highest honors they had. It was the civic crown, which was really just a wreath made of oak leaves. It sounds like something modest, but it was very hard to get because you had to save the life of another Roman in a battle and then actually hold that ground afterward. If a soldier wore that crown, it changed his life. Even a commoner who earned it could sit with the elite at festivals, and the highest officials in the city would stand up when he walked into a room. It took a single moment of bravery and turned it into a lifetime of social status. There were other rewards for different feats of strength, like metal torques or bracelets, and these silver discs called phalleri that they would strap onto their chest plates. When a unit marched through a city, you could hear the rattling of all those medals, and it was a reminder of their history and what they could do. It created a visible hierarchy based on merit. A recruit could look at a veteran covered in silver and see exactly where his own life could go. It didn't matter where you were born. It was about what you were willing to do for the person standing next to you, and it pointed all that ambition toward the common good. That culture of honor kept their spirit alive, but a soldier still has to eat. The Romans backed up those psychological rewards with a massive, centralized supply chain, and that was the real secret to how they endured. They didn't just move along and hope the land would provide food. They built a whole network of state-run granaries and warehouses that went from Italy all the way out to the edges of the frontier. This system meant that even during a winter campaign or a long siege, the grain and the leather and the iron stayed moving toward the front lines. The logistics were reliable enough that the soldiers could just focus on their training and their engineering. They knew the empire was working behind them to keep the machine fueled. Being able to stay fed and equipped for years gave them an advantage over enemies who had to stop fighting whenever a local harvest failed. Hunger is what usually ruins an army more than any weapon or battle, but the Romans handled it by making food a matter of law. They had this system called the Annona Militaris. It was a tax, a centralized thing they set up specifically to make sure the military always had what it needed to eat. It wasn't something where they just relied on local farmers to help when they could. It was a machine. They were moving thousands of tons of grain and wine and olive oil across thousands of miles, and it was predictable. A soldier could be in the forests in Britannia or out in the heat in Egypt, but he always knew what his rations were going to be. Grain was the main thing, the foundation of it, and then they had salt. Salt was so important for keeping food from spoiling and for their health that it's where we get the word salary from. Having that supply line meant they didn't fall into the same trap as everyone else. Most armies back then had to forage, which really just meant they were stealing from people or they were starving. When you have to hunt for your own food like that, the army gets distracted and disorganized. You can't stay in one spot for very long if you're eating everything around you. But a Roman legion could just stay put. They could sit through a siege for months or years because they knew the wagons and the ships were always on the way. It changed how the men acted. If a soldier is well fed, he stays in his rank and he does what he's told. It takes away that desperation that makes people desert or start a mutiny. The state became the provider, and that made the army stable. It wasn't just a crowd of people anymore, it was part of the government. And that focus on order and things being consistent went beyond just the food, because they had specific laws for everything a man did once he was in that uniform. The Romans had a legal code for their soldiers that was as rigid as the walls they built around their camps. They knew that just being afraid of an enemy wasn't going to keep a line from breaking, so they set up a structure where the law was more certain than whatever was happening in the chaos of a battle. A soldier wasn't just following an officer's orders. He was following a written set of rules that laid out every behavior and the exact consequence if he failed. It was a huge shift because it took power away from the whims of a leader and put it into a formal system. If a man fell asleep on watch or left his post during a skirmish, there wasn't any room for excuses or a way to negotiate out of it. The punishments were legendary for how severe they were. They wanted the idea of disobeying to be more terrifying than the prospect of actually fighting. In the worst cases, when there was collective cowardice, they used a practice where one man out of every 10 was chosen by lot to face the ultimate penalty from his own peers. It was a dark burden, but the message was that the group surviving mattered more than the individual. This kind of legal clarity did more than just threaten the men, though. It gave them a sense of predictability and protection that you didn't see much in the ancient world. A legionary knew what his rights were, and he knew how his pay was handled or how a dispute in the tents would be resolved. There was a protocol for everything. It meant that no matter which legion a man was in, the expectations stayed the same from the border of Persia all the way to the hills of Spain. It created this universal culture of obedience where the standard never really wavered. The Romans looked at the army through a lens of efficiency because of this obsession with order and keeping the unit together. They realized that a soldier who was broken by a fever or an infection was just as lost to the state as a soldier who died in combat. They took that engineering mindset and applied it to the human body, and they built a medical system that ended up being centuries ahead of its time. Keeping a soldier in good health was seen as a necessary investment, something they did because it was practical, not just because they were being compassionate. The Romans had realized quite early that they were losing more men to infections and these mystery illnesses that spread through crowded camps than they ever lost in actual combat. So to deal with that, they created the valetudinarium. It was the first time anyone had built a dedicated system for military hospitals. These weren't just temporary tents for people to lie down in. They were actual buildings, usually rectangular. and the architecture was very specific because they wanted to prioritize things like light and quiet and getting air to circulate through the rooms. The engineers would find the most peaceful spot in the camp to put these buildings. They kept them away from the main gates and the noise of the blacksmiths because they understood that recovering from a wound required a completely different environment than the rest of the army. Everything they did was built on sanitation. They were really focused on the quality of the water and how well the drains worked. They knew that if a camp was set up in a swampy area or near water that didn't move, the men would just start to fade away from what they called camp fever. So they made sure every hospital had fresh, running water and a system to wash waste away, and that alone dropped the rate of illness among the troops significantly. The medical staff they used were highly specialized. They had tools, things like bronze forceps and scalpels, that actually look very modern if you see them today. They practiced a version of triage where the entire goal was to get a veteran back into the fight as fast as they could. It meant a centurion with 20 years of experience who got hurt in a skirmish could be patched up and sent back to his unit rather than being sent home as an invalid. This gave the legions a huge advantage when it came to endurance. They weren't always stuck training new recruits to replace the ones who got sick. They were keeping their best fighters and their leaders in the field. Eventually, that same focus on technical mastery and planning moved from the land to the sea. They realized that if they wanted to control their borders, they had to dominate the water, and not just by boarding other ships for hand-to-hand fighting. They wanted to use the mechanical power of the ships themselves. They started refining the shape of the vessels until they had these massive, multi-level galleys that were basically heavy artillery platforms. They used rows of oarsmen in these complex setups to get enough torque to turn the entire ship into a projectile. Whether it was the design of a hospital ward or the deck of a quinquereme, it was all part of the same engineering system, and it was designed to outlast whatever obstacles they ran into. Securing the open water eventually meant moving away from brute strength and focusing on speed. Once the Romans were established as a naval power, they found that those old 5-banked galleys were just becoming a burden. They were heavy ships, and they worked for those massive clashes between civilizations, but they were too slow for the daily threats an empire faces. So they took a design from the Illyrian pirates called the Liburnian galley. It was light, only 2 banks of oars, and it put agility ahead of size. It changed everything about how they policed the Mediterranean. The Liburnian wasn't a floating fortress. It was built more like a predator, narrow and fast, which made it the right tool for chasing raiding boats into rocky coves where they used to hide. These ships were small, and you could build them quickly in large numbers so the navy could be everywhere at once. They were the heartbeat of maritime law. They kept the routes open so the grain and the gold from the provinces actually reached the capital. That constant presence turned the sea into what they called our lake. It was a private highway. The real advantage of the Liburnian was the shallow draft. It didn't sit deep in the water, so it wasn't stuck in the open sea. These ships could sail into the mouths of rivers and go hundreds of miles inland where a normal warship would just run aground. It gave the Roman command a new advantage that was honestly terrifying. A legion could be fighting in a forest or along a frontier river, and suddenly a fleet of warships appears around the bend with supplies or more troops. The navy and the army weren't separate anymore. They were an integrated force that could push power into the heart of a continent. That ability to reach into every corner made the empire feel inescapable. If an enemy was across a coastline or behind a mountain, they knew the Romans had a tool to find them. It was a mastery of the environment, from the ocean to a narrow stream, and it let the legions keep up a pressure that never stopped. When that pressure finally reached the walls of a stubborn city, the Romans had a way of getting in that focused on the one place you'd never expect to see a soldier. When the Romans were out on a battlefield, safety usually came down to the things you couldn't see on the ground. They were known for these massive engineering projects and stone walls, but they were just as good at using small tools to manage how an enemy moved. They had this device called a tribulus or a caltrop, which was just 4 iron spikes. It was built so that no matter how it landed, one point was always facing up. Before a battle, they would just scatter thousands of them into the grass or across river crossings. It was area denial, really. The goal wasn't to wipe out an army all at once, but to change the psychology of the ground. If you're leading a cavalry charge and horses start hitting these iron points, the momentum just stops. A horse that's limping isn't going to charge, and a soldier who has to watch every single step he takes isn't looking at the Roman line anymore. It turned an open field into an obstacle course. The interesting thing about the caltrop is how much it did for such a low cost. You didn't need engineers or piles of timber. Just a few bags of these iron stars could take away the advantage of a fast enemy. It forced them to slow down and basically become a stationary target for the archers and the artillery. The legions were essentially redesigning the geography of the fight. They were deciding where you could walk and where you had to stop. It shows a defensive strategy that goes beyond just holding a shield. The Romans didn't want to leave things to chance, so they used these traps to make sure the enemy was tired and frustrated by the time they reached the front line. It was a methodical way of taking away options until there was nowhere left to go except where the Romans wanted. Even in difficult places like the forests and swamps in the north, they kept that sense of control. They took what they knew about wood and earth and movement and turned it into a strategy that let them dominate places that should have been impossible to hold. People living in a frontier town could tell whenever a soldier was walking down the street just by the sound he made. It was the cingulum militale, this heavy military belt, and it functioned like a badge that separated him from everyone else. The belt was made of thick leather and covered in these metal plates, and it had an apron of leather strips hanging down the front that were also reinforced with iron or bronze. When the soldier moved, all those metal pieces would click and jingle against each other. It was a rhythmic noise that followed him everywhere. It wasn't just a sound, really, but a signal of power and the backing of the Roman state, especially in a world where most people were just wearing simple tunics. Wearing that belt was a matter of legal identity. Only men in active service were allowed to wear it, so putting it on every morning became a ritual that reminded a man of his oath and where he fit in the hierarchy. If a legionary committed a crime or lacked discipline, they would take his belt away as punishment. Being seen in public without that jingling apron was a deep shame. It meant you weren't a protector anymore. You were just an ordinary person stripped of your authority. There was this psychological bond between a man and his gear because of that. He didn't see the belt as something to hold a dagger or a tunic. He saw it as his pride on display. This focus on status turned the military into its own distinct class. Even off-duty, the belt stayed on because it gave them certain rights and made them feel part of something larger. It was a system that used law and engineering to turn individuals into a machine. By tying a soldier's self-worth to a piece of equipment, the Roman command made sure every man was personally invested in the standards of the legion. It was the glue that held the empire together during the difficult years. No matter how far a soldier was from the capital, he stayed Roman because he was carrying that tradition right there on his waist. Winning a battle wasn't a matter of just throwing everyone you had into the fight at the same time. The Romans looked at it differently, more like a test of how long you could last, and they had this way of keeping their real strength out of sight until the end. Most armies back then would just charge in one big wave and exhaust themselves. But the Roman system used a series of waves instead. They had this three-tiered structure that worked like an insurance policy against everything going wrong. The first line was always the youngest guys, the ones with the most energy who could take that first heavy hit when the two sides met. Then right behind them, you had the more experienced soldiers just waiting and watching the fight. And way in the back were the veterans. These were the men who had seen every trick there was. They would actually sit down on one knee while the battle was going on in front of them, just resting and saving their energy. It gave the general a fresh answer for whatever happened. If those first guys started to get tired or the enemy found a gap, the second line would just step through, and suddenly there was this rested wall of iron in the way. It was a rhythm that just wore people down. An enemy would think they were finally winning, but then they'd be facing a new group of disciplined soldiers who hadn't even started to sweat yet. It was a psychological trap, really. It made the other side use up all their adrenaline while the Romans were still holding onto their best men. That final line was the ultimate safety net. There was a saying they had that things had come down to the veterans, which meant the situation was about as serious as it gets. When those guys finally stood up and started moving forward, that was usually it. They were the most skilled and the most determined, and seeing them arrive would just break the morale of an enemy that was already exhausted. Having that kind of depth changed the army from a crowd into a structure that could take a hit and then strike back harder. It meant there was always a backup plan. That timing and the way they managed their men is what turned disasters into victories and made them the most durable military anyone had ever seen. The Roman way of war always came back to this idea that one person was just a building block for a much larger machine. It wasn't really about having a sharper blade or a heavier shield than everyone else. The genius of it was how they took logistics and psychology and engineering and just turned it all into one single system of thought. You see it in how they organized their maniples so every officer had a voice, and even in the metal belts the soldiers wore to give them a sense of pride. They were designing a culture of total reliability. These 25 breakthroughs didn't just win battles. They built a framework that let Rome project power across 3 continents for 1,000 years. Usually, we measure a legacy in stone or law, but you can still see the shadow of the legions in how the modern world works today. When we look at how a modern military organizes its ranks or how much importance we put on building roads and bridges during a crisis, that's the Roman blueprint in action. They were the ones who proved the best weapon is a clear plan and a solid supply line. They took the chaos of fighting and turned it into a professional science where every movement had a purpose and every problem had a mechanical solution. The story of these innovations shows that success comes down to how well a community can adapt and build things together. When you think about the scale of the ingenuity it took to hold an empire that size together, it makes you wonder which tool mattered most. There was the physical power of the siege engines, but then there was the mental discipline of the knightly camp. Leave a comment about which innovation you think was the most critical for their survival. And if you want to keep looking at how these ancient ideas shaped the world we live in now, subscribe and we can continue going through the archives.